The African Queen by C.S. Forester. Although she herself was ill enough to justify being in bed, Rose Sayer could see that her brother, the Reverend Samuel Sayer, was far more ill. He was very weak indeed, and when he knelt to offer up the evening prayer, the movement was more like an involuntary collapse than a purposed gesture, and the hands which he raised trembled violently. Rose could see, in the moment before she devoutly closed her eyes, how thin and transparent those hands were, and how the bones of the wrists could be seen with almost the definition of a skeleton's. The damp heat of the African forest seemed to be intensified with the coming of the night, which closed in upon them while they prayed. Rose could feel the stream of sweat running down beneath her clothes as she knelt, and forming two little pools at the back of her knees. Samuel prayed for heavenly guidance in the ordering of their lives, for the forgiveness of their sins, and for the blessing of God upon the mission to which they had given their lives. The mission could hardly be said to exist now that von Hanneken and his troops had descended upon the place and swept off the entire village, converts and heathen alike, to be soldiers or bearers in the army of German Central Africa which he was assembling. Livestock and poultry, pots and pans and foodstuffs, all had been taken, leaving only the mission bungalow standing on the edge of the deserted clearing. Samuel went on to pray that the awful calamity of war which had descended upon the world would soon pass away, that the slaughter and destruction would cease. There was a ring of fighting spirit in his voice and an Old Testament flavour in his speech, as another Samuel had once prayed for victory over the Amalekites. They knelt in silence for a few seconds when the prayer was finished, and then they rose to their feet. There was still just light enough for Rose to see Samuel's white-clad figure and white face as he stood there swaying. "I think, sister, that I shall retire now," he said. "Good night." Even in that sweltering heat his teeth were chattering. Rose went back to her own room and lay on her string bed in a torment of heat. Outside she could hear the noise of the African night, the howling of the monkeys, the shriek of some beast of prey, and the continuous high-pitched whine of the mosquitoes. It may have been midnight before she fell asleep, moving uneasily in the heat, but it was almost dawn when she awoke. Samuel must have been calling to her. She hurried out of her bedroom, across the living room into Samuel's room. But if Samuel had been sufficiently conscious to call to her, he was not so now. Most of what he was saying seemed unintelligible. For a moment it appeared as if he were explaining the failure of his life to the tribunal before which he was soon to appear. "The poor mission," he said. It was the Germans. He died very soon after that, while Rose wept at his bedside. When her paroxysm of grief had passed away, she slowly got to her feet, and the morning sun was pouring down upon the forest and lighting the deserted clearing, and she was all alone. The fear which followed her grief did not last long. Rose Sayer had not lived to the age of 33, had not spent 10 years in the Central African forest, without acquiring a capable self-reliance to add to the simple faith of her religion. It was not long before a wild resentment against Germany and the Germans began to inflame her as she stood in the quiet bungalow with the dead man. She told herself that Samuel would not have died if his heart had not been broken by the catastrophe of von Hanneken's requisitions. It was that which had killed Samuel, the sight of the labours of 10 years being swept away in an hour. Rose told herself that Germans had worse than Samuel's death on their souls. They had injured the work of God. Rose had no illusion how much Christianity would be left to the converts after a campaign in the forest in the ranks of a native army, of which 99 men out of 100 would be heathen. She tried to persuade herself that this was a worse sin than being instrumental in Samuel's death, but she could not succeed in doing so. From childhood she had been taught to love and admire her brother. She had been his housekeeper, his faithful disciple, and his trusted helper for a dozen years. There is small wonder at her feeling an unchristian rancour against the nation who had caused his death. And naturally she could not see the other side of the question. Von Hanneken, with no more than 500 white men in a colony peopled by 1 million Negroes, had to face the task of defending the whole of German Central Africa. It was his duty to fight to the bitter end, to keep occupied as many of the enemy as possible for as long as possible, and to die in the last ditch if necessary, while the real decision was being fought out in France. Thanks to the British command of the sea, he could expect no help whatsoever from outside. He must depend on his own resources entirely, while there was no limit to the reinforcements which might reach the enemy. It was only natural, then, that with German military thoroughness he should have called up every man, woman, and child within reach, as bearers or soldiers, and that he should have swept away every atom of food and material he could lay his hands on. Rose saw no excuse for him at all. She remembered she had always disliked the Germans. She remembered how on her first arrival in the colony with her brother, German officialdom had plagued them with inquisitions and restrictions, had treated them with scorn and contempt. She hated their manners, their morals, their laws, and their ideals. In fact, Rose was carried away in the wave of international hatred which engulfed the rest of the world in August 1914. Had not her martyred brother prayed for the success of British arms and the defeat of the Germans? She yearned to strike a blow for England, to smite the Amalekites, the Philistines, and the Midianites. Yet even as the hot wave of fervour swept over her, she pulled herself up with scorn of herself for daydreaming. Here she was alone in the Central African forest, alone with a dead man. There was no possible chance of her achieving anything. It was at this very moment that Rose looked out across the veranda of the bungalow and saw opportunity peering cautiously at her from the edge of the clearing. She did not recognize it as opportunity. She had no idea that the man who appeared there would be the instrument she would employ to strike her blow for England. All she recognized was that it was Allnutt, a Cockney engineer employed by the Belgian gold mining company 200 miles up the river, a man her brother had been inclined to set his face sternly against as an unchristian example. But it was an English face, and a friendly one, and she hurried onto the veranda and waved a welcome. Allnutt was apprehensive. He looked around him cautiously as he made his way towards her. "Where is everybody, miss?" he asked as he came up to her. "They've all gone," said Rose. "Where's the Reverend, your brother?" "He's in there," said Rose. "He's dead." Her lips began to tremble a little as they stood there in the blazing sunlight, but she would not allow herself to show weakness. "Oh, that's bad, miss," said Allnutt. But it was clear that, for the moment, his sympathy was purely perfunctory. His apprehension was such that he could only think about one subject at a time. "Have the Germans been here, miss?" he asked. "Yes," said Rose. "Look!" The wave of a hand indicated the bare central circle of the village. Had it not been for von Hanneken, this would have been full of chattering, smiling Negroes, with chickens and eggs, and 100 other things for barter, and naked pot-bellied children running about, and women working in the gardens, and perhaps a group of men coming up from the direction of the river laden with fish. As it was, there was nothing, only the bare earth and the ring of deserted huts, and the silent forest hemming them in. "I found it just the same up at the mine," said Allnutt. "Clean sweep of everything. What they've done with the Belgians, God only knows. I've been up the river to Limbazi with a launch for stores. They'd heard about the war up there, but they didn't think von Hanneken would fight. Just handed the stuff over to me and let me go again. I thought all the time it wouldn't be as easy as they said. Bet von Hanneken has done the same to them as he's done at the mine. But he hasn't got the launch, nor yet what's in her, which he'd be glad to have, I dare say." "And what's that?" demanded Rose. "Blasting gelatin, miss. 8 boxes of it, and tin grub, and cylinders of oxygen and hydrogen for that welding job on the crusher." They were inside the bungalow now, and Allnutt took off his battered sun hat as he realized he was in the presence of death. He bowed his head and lapsed into unintelligibility. Garrulous as he might be when talking of war, or of his own experiences, he was a poor hand at formal condolences. But there was one obvious thing to say. "Excuse me, miss, how long's he been dead?" "He died this morning," said Rose. The same thought came into her mind as was already in Allnutt's. In the tropics, a dead man must be buried within 6 hours, and Allnutt was further obsessed with his desire to get away quickly, to retire again to his sanctuary in the river backwaters, far from German observation. I'll bury him, miss," he said. "Now, don't you worry yourself, I'll do it all right." Allnutt came out onto the veranda again. His shifty gaze swept the edge of the forest for Germans, before it was directed upon the clearing to find a site for a grave. "Just there, be the best place," he said. "The ground would be light there, and he'd like to be in the shade, I expect." When it was all over, Rose stood in sorrow beside the grave with its makeshift cross. Allnutt moved restlessly beside her. "Come on down to the river, miss," he urged. Let's get away from here." The launch hardly seemed worthy of her grandiloquent name of African Queen. She was squat, flat-bottomed, and 30 feet long. Her paint was peeling off, and she reeked of decay. A tattered awning roofed in 6 feet of the stern. Amidships stood the engine and the boiler, with a stumpy funnel reaching up just higher than the awning. Rose could feel the heat from the thing where she sat, as an addition to the heat of the sun. Allnutt knelt in the bottom of the boat and addressed himself to the engine. He hauled out a pan full of hot ashes and dumped them over the side with a sizzle and a splutter, then filled the furnace with fresh wood from the pile beside him. And soon smoke appeared from the funnel, and Rose could hear the roar of the draught. The engine began to sigh and splutter, and leak grey pencils of steam. Allnutt peered at his gauges, then leaped forward round the engine. With grunts and heaves at the small windlass, he proceeded to haul in the anchor, the sweat pouring from him in rivers. As the anchor came clear, and the rushing current began to sweep the boat into the bank, he came dashing aft again to the engine. There was a clanking noise, and Rose felt the propeller begin to vibrate beneath her. Allnutt thrust mightily at the muddy bank with a long pole, snatched the latter on board again, and then came rushing aft to the tiller. He swept her aside unceremoniously as he put the tiller over just in time to save the boat from running into the bank. They headed, grinding and clattering, out into the racing brown water. I thought, miss," said Allnutt, "we might find somewhere quiet behind an island where we couldn't be seen, and then we could talk about what we ought to do." "I should think that would be best," said Rose. The river Ulunga, at this point of its course, has a rather indefinite channel. It loops and winds, and its banks are marshy, and it is studded with islands. The African Queen churned her slow way against the current, quartering across the broad arm in which they had started. Half a mile up on the other bank, half a dozen channels offered themselves, and Allnutt swung the boat's nose towards the midmost of them. "Would you mind holding the tiller, miss? Just as it is now," he said. Rose silently took hold of the iron rod. It was so hot that it seemed to burn her hand. Allnutt was violently active once more. He pulled open the furnace door, thrust in a few more sticks of fuel, and then he scrambled up into the bows and stood balanced on the cargo, peering up the channel for snags and shoals. "Port a little, miss," he called. "Pull it over this side, I mean. That's it. Steady." The boat crawled up into a narrow tunnel formed by the meeting of the foliage overhead. Allnutt came leaping back over the cargo and shut off the engine, so that the propeller ceased to vibrate. And then he dashed into the bows once more, and just as the trees at Rose's side began apparently to move forward again as the current overcame the boat's way, he let go the anchor with a crash and a rattle, and the African Queen came to a standstill in the green-lighted channel. As the noise of the anchor chain died away, a great silence seemed to close in upon them, the silence of a tropical river at noon. Allnutt came back into the stern sheets. "Well, here we are, miss," he said, "safe and sound. We got heaps of grub, so we're all right as that goes. 2,000 fags, 2 cases of gin, we can stay here for months." The implication of his speech was obvious. He was suggesting that they should remain here in this marshy backwater until the war was over, and they could emerge in safety. And it was equally obvious that he had not the remotest idea of striking a blow for England. "The trouble is," he went on, "we don't know which way it will come. If our lot comes from the sea, they'll fight their way up the railway to Limbassy, I suppose, so we could stay here and just go up to Limbassy when the time came. Of course, they might come down from the British East. They'd stand a better chance of catching Von Anakin that way. They'll hunt him for him in the forest, won't be no child's play. One thing's for sure anyway, they won't come up from the Congo side. There's only one way to cross that way, and that's across the lake. And nothing won't cross the lake while the Louisa's there. The Königin Louise, whose name Allnutt characteristically anglicised to Louisa, was the police steamer which the German government maintained on Lake Wittelsbach. She had been brought up from the coast overland in sections 8 years before. The country had been swept for bearers and workmen then as now, for there had been roads to hack through the forest and enormous burdens to be carried. Once she had been assembled and launched, the Königin Louise had swept the lake free immediately from the canoe pirates who had infested its waters from time immemorial. With her 10-knot speed she could run down any canoe fleet, and with her 6-pounder gun she could shell any pirate village into submission. So that commerce had begun to develop on the lake, and agriculture had begun to spread along its shores. No invasion whatever could be pushed across the lake in the face of the Königin Louise. Germany ruled the waters of Lake Wittelsbach as indisputably as England ruled those of the Straits of Dover. If it wasn't for the Louisa, went on Allnutt, there wouldn't be no trouble here. Old Von Anakin couldn't last a month if they could get at him across the lake. But as it is... Allnutt's gesture indicated that screened on the other 3 sides by the forest, Von Anakin might prolong his resistance indefinitely. "But all this doesn't get us any nearer home, does it, miss?" he concluded. "Bless me if I can think what we ought to do." "We must do something for England," said Rose. She would have said, "We must do our bit," if she had been acquainted with the wartime slang, which was at that moment beginning to circulate in England. But what she said meant the same thing, and it did not sound too melodramatic in the African forest. "Caw," said Allnutt. His notion had been to put the maximum possible distance between himself and the struggle. He had taken it for granted that this war, like other wars, would be fought by the people paid and trained for the purpose. Out of touch with the patriotic fervour of the press, nothing had been further from his thoughts than that he should interfere. And yet, having regard to the light which shone in Rosie's face at that moment, he thought it might be as well to temporise, just to humour her. "Oh, yes, miss," he said earnestly. "If there was anything we could do, I'd be the first to say we ought to do it. What's your notion, especially?" He dropped the question carelessly enough, secure in his certainty that there was nothing she could suggest, nothing, anyway, which could stand against an argument. "This river, the Yolanga," said Rose, "it runs into the lake, doesn't it?" "Well, miss, it does, but if you was thinking of going to the lake in this launch, well, you needn't think about it any more. We can't, and that's certain." "Why not?" Rapids, miss. Rocks and cataracts and gorges. You haven't been there. I mean, I have. There's 100 miles of rapids down there. Why, the river's got a different name when it comes out in the lake to what it's called up here. It's the Bora down there. That just shows you. No one knew they was in the same river until that chap, the Spengler, he got down it, I remember. Yeah, well, yes, miss, in a dug-out canoe with 6 Swahili paddlers, map-making he was. There's places where this old river ain't more than 20 yards wide, and the water goes shooting down there like water out of a tap. How did the African Queen get here in the first place? Well, by rail, miss, I suppose, like all the other heavy stuff. Expect they sent it up to Limbazi from the coast in sections and then put it all together on the bank. Rose had been accustomed all her life to follow the guidance of another. She came of a stratum of society and of history in which women adhered to her menfolk's opinions. She was thinking for herself now for the first time in her life, if exceptions be made for housekeeping problems. It was not easy, this forming of her own judgments, especially when it involved making an estimate of a man's character and veracity. She stared fixedly at Allnutt's face, through the cloud of flies that hovered around it, and Allnutt, conscious of her scrutiny, fidgeted uncomfortably. Resolve was hardening in her heart. She felt within her a boiling flood of patriotism. Restlessly she rose from her seat and went forward to where the stores were heaped up in the bows, all the miscellany of stuff comprised in the regular fortnight's consignment to the Belgian mine. She looked at it for inspiration. just as she had looked at the contents of the larder when confronted with a housekeeping problem. Allnutt came and stood beside her. "What are those boxes with the red lines on them?" she demanded. "Oh, that's the blasting gelatin I told you about, miss." "Isn't it dangerous?" "Oh, bless you, miss, no. This is safety stuff, this is. If you can let it get wet, it doesn't do no harm. If you set fire to it, it just burns. You can do it with an hammer and it won't go off. What you mustn't do is bang off detonators, gunpowder, or cartridges into it. But we won't be doing that, miss. I'll put it over the side if it worries you, though." "No," said Rose sharply. "We may want it." In the very bottom of the boat, half covered with boxes, lay 2 large iron tubes, rounded at one end, conical at the other, and in the conical ends were brass fittings, taps, and pressure gauges. "What are those?" asked Rose. "Well, they're cylinders of oxygen and hydrogen, miss," said Allnutt. They look like torpedoes," said Rose. And with the words, a plan began to develop in her mind. She turned upon the Cockney mechanic. "Allnutt," she demanded, "could you make a torpedo?" Allnutt smiled pityingly at that. Could I make a torpedo?" he said. "Ask me to build you a dreadnought and do the thing in style. It's this way, you see, miss." Allnutt's little lecture on the nature of torpedoes was in the main correct, and his estimate of his incapacity to make one was absolutely correct. Torpedoes are representative of the last refinements of human ingenuity. To make a torpedo capable of running true, in a straight line, and at a uniform depth, as Allnutt pointed out, would call for a workshop full of skilled mechanics, supplied with accurate tools, and working under the direction of a specialist on that subject. No one could expect Allnutt, working by himself in the heart of the African forest, with only the African Queen's repair outfit, to achieve even the veriest botch of an attempt at it. Allnutt fairly let himself go on the allied subjects of gyroscopes and compressed air chambers and vertical rudders and horizontal rudders and compensating weights. Most of the technicalities fell upon deaf ears. Rose heard them without hearing. Inspiration was in full flood. "But all these things," she said, when at last Allnutt's dissertation came to an end, "all these gyroscopes and things, they're only to make the thing go, aren't they?" Yeah, I suppose so." "Well," said Rose with decision, "we've got the African Queen. If we put this blasting gelatine in front of the boat with what did you say, a detonator there, that would be a torpedo, wouldn't it? Those cylinders would stick over the end with the gunpowder stuff in them, and the detonators in the ends where those taps are. Then, if we ran the boat against the side of a ship, they'd go off, just like a torpedo." There was almost admiration mingled with the tolerant pity with which Allnutt regarded Rose now. He had a respect for original ideas, and as far as he knew, this was an original idea. He did not know that the earliest forms of torpedoes ever used had embodied this invention 50 years ago, although the early users of it took the precaution of attaching the explosive to a spar rigged out ahead of the launch in a fashion minimizing the danger of the crew's being hoisted with its own petard. Allnutt, in fact, made this very objection. "Yeah, and supposing we did that," he said, "supposing we found something we wanted to torpedo, and what that would be, I don't know, because this is the only boat on the river, and supposing we did torpedo it, what would happen to us? It would blow the whole launch and us and everything else to kingdom come." "I wasn't thinking," said Rose, "that we should be in the launch. Couldn't we get everything ready and have a good head of steam up, and then just point the launch towards the ship and send her off? Wouldn't that do?" Allnutt tried to keep his amusement out of sight. He felt it would be useless to point out all the flaws in the scheme, the fact that the African Queen's boiler was long past the days when it could take a good head of steam, and that her propeller, like all single propellers, had a tendency to drive the boat round in a curve, so that taking aim would be a matter of chance, and that the African Queen's 4 knots would be quite insufficient to allow her approach to take any ship by surprise. There wasn't anything to torpedo anyway, so nothing good could come of this woman's harebrained suggestions. He might as well try to humour her. "Well," he said gravely, "it might work." "And these cylinders would do all right for torpedoes?" "I think so, miss, yes. I could let the gas out of them and fill them up with gelignite. We could cut holes in the bows of the launch, have the cylinders sticking out through them, so as to get the explosion as near the water as possible. It might do the trick." "All right," said Rose. "We'll go down to the lake and torpedo the Louisa." Allnutt was dumbfounded. "Don't talk silly, miss. We can't do that. Honest, we can't. I told you before, we can't get down the river." "Spengler did. In a canoe, miss. That just shows we can too." Allnutt sighed ostentatiously. "Oh, have it your own way then, miss," he said resignedly. "Only don't blame me, that's all." He knew perfectly well that there was no possible chance of inducing the African Queen to make the descent of the rapids of the Ulanga. He appreciated, in a way Rose could not, the difference between a handy canoe with 6 skilled paddlers and a clumsy launch like the African Queen. He knew the terrific strength and the terrifying appearance of water running at high speed. Rose's scheme appeared to him to be a lunatic's dream. What he expected was that after 1 or 2 experiences of minor rapids, the sight of a major one might bring the woman to her senses. Failing that, he hoped for an unspectacular and safe shipwreck, which would solve the problem for them. Or the extremely unreliable machinery of the African Queen might give way irreparably, or even, happy thought, might be induced to do so. Anyway, there were 200 miles of comfortable river ahead before the rapids began, and Allnutt's temperament was such that anything a week off was hardly worth worrying about. He sat down leisurely beside the engine, cocked his feet up on a pile of wood, and lit a cigarette. He drew in a deep lungful of smoke and expelled it again with satisfaction. And then he became aware that Rose was still standing opposite him, as if expecting something of him. Startled, he raised his eyes to her face. "Come on," said Rose. "Aren't we going to start?" "What, now, miss?" "Yes, now. Come along." Allnutt was up against hard facts again. It was enough, in his opinion, to have agreed with the lady, to have admitted her to be right, as a gentleman should. Allnutt's impression was that they might start tomorrow if the gods were unkind, next week if they were favourable. To set off like this at half an hour's notice to torpedo the German Navy seemed to him unseemly, or at least unnatural. "Well, there isn't 2 hours of daylight left, miss," he said, looking down the backwater to the light on the river. "We can go a long way in 2 hours," said Rose. "I'll have to get the old kettle to boil again," said Allnutt. Yet he got down from his seat, took up his habitual attitude beside the engine, and there were embers still glowing in the furnace. It was only a few minutes after filling it with wood and slamming the door that it began its cheerful roar, and soon after that the engine began to sigh and splutter and leak steam. Allnutt commenced the activities which had been forced upon him by the desertion of his 2 negro hands, winding in the anchor, shoving off from the bank, and starting the propeller turning, all as nearly simultaneously as might be. Rose watched his movements. She was anxious to learn all about this boat. She took the tiller and set herself to learn to steer. During the first few minutes of the lesson, she thought to herself that it was a typical man-made arrangement, that the tiller had to be put to the right to turn the boat to the left. But that feeling vanished very quickly. In fact, under Allnutt's coaching, it was not very long before even she began to see the sense in a convention which spoke of port and starboard. The voyage began with a bit of navigation which was exciting and interesting, as they threaded their way through backwaters among the islands. And there were snags about and floating vegetation nearly submerged, which might entangle the screw. There were shoals and mud banks to be avoided. It was not until some minutes had elapsed, and they were already a mile or 2 on their way, that a stretch of easy water gave Rose leisure to think, and she recalled with a shock that she had left behind the mission station where she had laboured for 10 years, her brother's grave, her home, everything there was in her world, in fact, and all without a thought. The moment of weakness passed, and she took a firmer grip on the tiller and peered forward with narrowed eyelids over the glaring surface of the river. Allnutt was being fantastically active with the engine. In the incredibly distant past, when the engine had been new, boiler pressure of 80 pounds to the square inch could be maintained, giving the launch a speed of 12 knots. Nowadays, if the pressure mounted above 15, the engine showed unmistakable signs of dissolution, and no speed greater than 4 knots could be reached, so that Allnutt had the delicate task of keeping the pressure just there, and no higher and no lower. Nor was this attention to the furnace made any easier by the tendency of the wood fuel to choke the draught with ash. Allnutt, when stoking, had to plan his campaign like a chess player, looking 6 moves ahead at least, bearing in mind the effect on the draught of emptying the ash pan, the relative inflammability of any one of the half-dozen different kinds of wood, the quite noticeable influence of direct sunlight on the boiler, and the chances of the safety valve sticking. "We'll have to anchor soon," he said suddenly, looking up from his labours, his face grey with grime and streaked with sweat. "Wood's running short." Rose looked round at where the sun had sunk to the tree-tops on the distant bank. "All right," she said grudgingly. "We'll find somewhere to spend the night." They went on with the engine clanking lugubriously to where the river broke up again into a fresh batch of distributaries. Allnutt cast a last lingering glance over his engine and scuttled up into the bows. "Round here, miss," he called with a wave of his arm. Rose put the tiller over, and they surged into a narrow channel. "Round here again," said Allnutt. "There's a channel here. Bring her up into it. Now steady. Keep her at that." They were heading upstream now, in a narrow passage roofed over by trees, whose roots, washed bare by the rushing brown water, and tangled together almost as thick as basket-work, constituted the surface of the banks. Against the sweeping current, the African Queen made bare headway. Allnutt let go the anchor, and running back, shut off the steam. The launch swung stationary to her moorings with hardly a jerk. Allnutt stood watching attentively for a moment to make certain that the anchor was not dragging, and then sat down with a sigh in the stern sheets. "Oh, it's hot work, isn't it, miss? I could do with a drink." From under the bench on which he sat, he dragged out a wooden case, and from out of the case he brought a bottle full of some clear liquid like water. He proceeded to pour a liberal portion into a tin mug. "What is that?" asked Rose. "Gin, miss," said Allnutt, "and there's only river water to drink it with." Rose's knowledge of strong drink was quite hazy. During her brother's ministry in England, she had heard drink and its evil effects discussed. There were even bad characters in the congregation who were addicted to it, and with whom she had sometimes tried to reason. At the mission, Samuel had striven ineffectively for 10 years to persuade his coloured flock to abandon the use of the beer they had been accustomed to brew from time immemorial, and there were festivals when everybody brewed and drank stronger liquors still, and got raging drunk and made fearful noises, and all had sore heads the next morning. Now Rose found herself face to face with this evil. She knew that drink made men madmen. Drink rotted their bodies and corrupted their souls. Drink brought ruin in this world and damnation in the next. Allnutt was now decanting river water into the gin, trying carefully, but not very effectively, to prevent too much alluvium from entering his drink. Rose watched with increasing fascination. She wanted to protest, to appeal to Allnutt's better feelings, even to snatch the terrible thing from him. And yet she stayed inert, unmoving. Allnutt drank the frightful stuff and smacked his lips. Oh, that's better," he said. He put the mug down. He did not start being maniacal, nor to sing songs, nor to reel about the boat. Instead, with his sinfulness still wet on his lips, he swung open the gates of paradise for Rose. "Now, I can think about supper," he said. "What about a cup of tea, miss?" Tea. Rose was limp and weary, and her throat ached. The imminent prospects of a cup of tea roused her to trembling excitement. 12 cups of tea each Samuel and she had drunk daily for years. Today she had had none. She had eaten no food either, but at that moment that meant nothing to her. "I'd like a cup of tea," she said. "The water's still boiling in the engine," said Allnutt, heaving himself to his feet. "Won't take a minute." The tinned meat they ate was, as a result of the heat, reduced to a rather greasy, semi-liquid mass. The native bread was dark and unpalatable, but the tea was marvellous. Rose drank it strong, mug after mug after mug of it. For a moment her body temperature shot up to fever heat, but presently there came a blissful perspiration. Not the sticky, prickly sweat in which she had moved all day long, but a beneficent and cooling fluid, bringing with it a feeling of ease and well-being. She felt positive friendship for Allnutt welling up within her. And when the scanty crockery had been washed and put away, Allnutt stood up and looked about him. The light was just failing. "You better sleep here in the stern, miss," he said, "in case it rains." "Where are you going to sleep?" asked Rose. "For'ard, miss. I can make a sort of bed out of them cases." "What? On the explosives?" "Yes, miss. Won't do 'em no harm." "You cover up well," Allnutt added. "Gets cold on the river towards morning." Allnutt retraced his steps into the bows, and Rose made her brief preparations for the night. She laid herself on the hard floorboards with a rug about her, and her head on a pillow of her spare clothing. Her mind was like a whirlpool in which circled a mad inconsequence of thoughts. Her brother had died only that morning, and it seemed at least a month ago. With her eyes closed, her retinas were haunted with persistent after-images of running water foaming round snags and rippling over shallows, and all agleam with sunshine where the wind played upon it. She thought of the Königin Louise, and she thought of Allnutt, only a yard or two from her virgin bed. She thought of the dead Samuel. She thought again of the play of the light and shade on the water when they had first anchored. And with that shifting pattern in her mind's eye, she fell asleep, utterly worn out. The day came with a rush, and for once the sun and the heat were beneficent and life-giving, instead of being malignant tyrants. Rose and Allnutt roused themselves. The whole backwater steamed like a laundry. "What's to be done before we move on?" asked Rose. Allnutt scratched his sprouting beard. "Got no wood," he said. "Have to fill up with that. Plenty of dead stuff here, I should think." He produced an axe, which was just as rusty and woebegone as everything else in the boat, hooked the bank with the boat hook, and swung himself ashore with the stern painter in his hand. He vanished into the undergrowth, looking cautiously around at every step for fear of snakes. At intervals he appeared on the bank, dumping down fresh discoveries of dead wood to add to the growing pile at the landing place, and then, pulling in on the stern painter, he began the ticklish job of loading the fuel on board, standing swaying perilously on the slippery, uneven foothold. When the wood was all on board, Rose said, "We had better start now." "Well, what about breakfast?" asked Allnutt. "We'll have that going along," said Rose. "Let's get started at once." Perhaps Rose had all her life been a woman of action and decision, but she had spent all her adult life under the influence of her brother. She had always been content to follow his advice and abide by his judgment, but now that she was alone, the reaction was violent. She was carrying out a plan of her own devising, and she would allow nothing to stop her, nothing to delay her. She was consumed by a fever for action. Allnutt philosophically shrugged his shoulders. The woman was a bit mad, but it would be more trouble to argue with her than to obey her, at present. Allnutt was not sufficiently self-analytical to appreciate that most of the troubles of his life resulted from attempts to avoid trouble. He addressed himself, in his usual attitude of prayer, to the task of getting the engine fire going again, and while the boiler was heating, he continued the endless task of lubrication. When the boiler began to sigh and gurgle, he looked inquiringly at Rose, and received a nod from her. The African Queen resumed her solemn career down the river, with Rose happily directing her. This was the main backwater of the section, a stream 100 yards wide, so there was no reason to apprehend serious navigational difficulties. Rose had already learned to recognize the ugly V-shaped ripple on the surface caused by a snag just below, and the choppy appearance which indicated shallows, and she understood now the useful point that the African Queen's draught was such that if an underwater danger was so deep as to make no alteration in the appearance of the surface, she could be relied upon to go over it without damage. The main possible source of trouble was in the wind. A brisk breeze whipped the surface of the river into choppy wavelets which obscured the warning signs. At present today there was no wind blowing. In this backwater, running between the marshy, uninhabited islands, there was no fear of observation from the shore. The navigation was easy, and the African Queen's engines were in a specially helpful mood, so that she squatted along without any particular crisis rising. Allnutt was even able to snatch half a dozen minutes in which to prepare breakfast. He brought Rosie's share to her, and she ate and drank as she held the tiller. Eventually the backwater came to an end, merging with the main river again. The banks fell away as they came out onto the broad, stately stream, a full half-mile wide, brilliantly blue in prospect under the cloudless sky. Allnutt did not like these open reaches. Von Hanneken and his army were somewhere on the banks of the river. Perhaps he had outposts watching everywhere. It was only when she was threading her way between islands that the African Queen could escape observation. He stood up on the gunwale anxiously, peering at the banks for a sign of a break in them. Rose swung the African Queen round so that she headed to the far side of the bend, where at the foot of the forest-clad bluffs the head of a long, narrow island was to be seen. Rose already knew enough about the river to know that the backwater behind the island was almost certainly the entrance to a fresh chain of minor channels, not rejoining the main river perhaps as much as 10 miles. The African Queen clanked solemnly across the river, and they glided out of the sunlight into the blessed shade of the narrow channel. That first day was typical of all the days they spent descending the river before they reached the rapids. There were times when the backwater they were navigating proved to be jammed by a tangle of tree trunks, and they had to go back cautiously in reverse until they found another channel. There was one occasion when their channel broadened out into a wide, almost stagnant lake surrounded by marshy islands and full of lilies and weeds. Rose was really alive for the first time in her life. She had passed 10 years in Central Africa, but she had not lived during those 10 years. That mission station had been a dreary place. Rose had not read books of adventure which might have told her what an adventurous place tropical Africa was. Samuel was not an adventurous person. He had not even taken a missionary's interest in botany or entomology. Housekeeping in a Central African village was far duller business than housekeeping in a busy provincial town, and German Central Africa was the dullest colony of all Africa. Samuel had not allowed Rose even to be interested in Allnutt's visits. Allnutt was a sinner who lived in unhallowed union with a negress up at the mine. They had to give him food and hospitality when he came, and to bring into the family prayers a mention of their wish for his redemption, but that was all. Those 10 years had been a period of heat-ridden monotony. It was different now, though. There was the broad scheme of proceeding to the lake and freeing it from the mastery of the Germans. That in itself was enough to keep anyone happy. And for detail to fill in the day, there was the river, wide, mutable, always different. There could be no monotony on this river with its snags and mud bars, its bends and its backwaters, its eddies and its swirls. Perhaps those few days of active happiness were sufficient recompense to Rose for 33 years of passive misery. There came an evening when Allnutt was silent and moody, as though labouring under some secret grievance. There was no feeling of companionship as they drank their tea, and when the tea was drunk, Allnutt got out the gin bottle and poured himself a drink, the second that day, and drank and filled his cup again, still silent and sulky. Rose watched these proceedings disconcerted. She realized by instinct that she must do something to maintain the morale of her crew. "What's the matter, Allnutt?" she asked gently. She was genuinely concerned about the unhappiness of the little cockney, quite apart from any thought of what bearing it might have upon the success of her enterprise. Allnutt only drank again, and looked sullenly down at the ragged canvas shoes on his feet. Rose came over nearer to him. "Tell me," she said, gently again, and then Allnutt answered, "We ain't going no farther down the river. Gone far enough." "Not going any farther?" she said. "Allnutt, of course we must." "No bloody of course about it," said Allnutt. "I can't think what's the matter," said Rose with perfect truth. "The river's the matter, that's what. And Shona,
If we go on tomorrow, we'll be in the rapids tomorrow night, and before we got to the rapids, we'll have to go past Shona. I'd forgotten about Shona till last night. But nothing is going to happen to us at Shona, ain't it? How do you know? If there's anywhere on this river the Germans are watching, it'll be Shona. That's where the road from the south crosses the river, and there ain't no sneaking past Shona. I've been there in this old African Queen. I know what the river's like. It's just one big bend, and there ain't no backwaters there nor nothing. And you can see clear across from one side to the other, and Shona's on an hill on the bank. But they won't be able to stop us. Won't be able? Don't talk silly, miss. They have rifles, machine guns, cannon traps. The river ain't more than half a mile wide there. Let's go past it at night, then. That won't do neither, 'cause the rapids start just below Shona. That hill Shona stands on is the beginning of the cliffs the river runs between. If we was to go past Shona in the dark, we'd have to go down the rapids in the dark. And I ain't going down no rapids in the dark. I ain't going down no rapids at all. Didn't ought to have come as far as this. They might find us here if they was to come out in canoes from Shona. I'm going back tomorrow, up that other backwater we was in yesterday. That's the safest place for us. Allnutt had shaken off all shame and false modesty. He preferred appearing a coward in Rose's eyes to risking going under fire at Shona, or to attempting the impossible descent of the gorges of the Yolanga. There was not going to be any more hanky-panky about it. He drank neat gin to set the seal on his resolution. Rose was white with angry disappointment. She tried to keep her temper, to plead, to cajole, but Allnutt was in no mood for argument. For a while he was silent, and made no attempt to combat Rose's urgings, merely opposing to them a solid inertia. Only when, in the growing darkness, Rose called him a liar and a coward, and Rose, in her sedate upbringing, had never used those words to anyone before, did he reply. "Guard yourself," he said. "You ain't no lady. That's what my poor old mother would have said to you, if my old mother was to hear you." When a man who is drinking neat gin starts talking about his mother, he is past all argument, as Rose began to suspect. She drew herself stiffly together in the stern sheets, while Allnutt's small orgy continued. She was alone in a small boat with a drunken man, a most dreadful situation. She sat tense in the darkness, ready to do battle for her life or her virtue, and quite certain that one or the other would be imperiled before morning. But Allnutt was neither amorous nor violent in his cups. He wept at his mother's memory. And then he wept over the fate of Carrie, which was his name for the brawny negress who had been his mistress at the mine. Then he mourned over his own expatriation, and he sobbed through his hiccups at the thought of his boyhood's friends in London. Then, in his mutterings, he began to discuss the question of sleep, and sure enough, the sound of his snores came, before long, through the darkness to Rose's straining ears. She had almost relaxed, when a thump and a clatter from Allnutt's direction brought her up to full tension again. But his peevish exclamations told her that he had only fallen from the seat to the floorboards, mug, bottle and all, and in 2 minutes he was happily snoring again, while Rose sat stiff and still, and the reek of the spilt gin filled the night air. Despair and hatred kept her from sleep. It was the first time she had ever really set her heart on anything, and Allnutt stood in her way immovable. Although for 30 years she had submitted quite naturally to the arbitrary decisions of the superior sex, this occasion was different. She wanted most passionately to go on. There was nothing left to live for if she could not get the African Queen down to the lake to strike her blow for England. She resolved, as the night wore on, to make Allnutt pay for his arbitrariness. She swore to herself to make Allnutt's life hell for him. Rose had never tried to raise hell in her life, but in her passion of resentment she felt inspired to it. Dawn revealed to her Allnutt lying like a corpse on the floorboards. His face, hardly veiled by the sprouting beard, was a dirty grey, and from his open mouth came soft but unpleasing sounds. Rose got to her feet and stepped over him. She dragged out the case of gin and took out a bottle. The cork was of the convenient kind which needs no corkscrew. She poured the stuff over the side, dropped the bottle in after it, and began on another. When for the third time the glug, glug, glug of poured liquid reached Allnutt's ears, he muttered something, opened his eyes, and tried to sit up. It was not the sight of what Rose was doing which called forth the exclamation, for he still did not know the reason for the noise which aroused him. Allnutt's head was like a lump of red-hot pain. It felt as if it were nailed to the floorboards, so that any attempt at raising it caused him agony. He shut his eyes and moaned. Rose flung one look of scorn at him, and then poured the last bottle of the case over the side. She went forward and dragged the second case of gin out from among the boxes of stores. She took Allnutt's favourite screwdriver and began to prise the case open with vicious wrenches of her powerful wrist. Allnutt rolled over to look at her again. With infinite trouble he got himself into a sitting position, with his hands at his temples, which felt as if they were being battered with white-hot hammers. He looked at her, quite uncomprehending, with his aching eyes. Rose wasted neither time nor sympathy on him. She went calmly on, pouring the gin over the side. She dropped the last bottle into the river, and returned to the stern sheets, apparently without noticing his presence. Took her toilet things from her tin box, picked up a rug, and went back again into the bows. By the time Allnutt was able to turn his head in that direction, the rug was pinned from the funnel stay to the funnel, screening her from view. And when she took down the rug again, her toilet was obviously finished. She folded the rug and began to prepare her breakfast, and then to eat it with perfect composure. Breakfast completed, she came back to the stern, but she still gave him neither look nor word. With an appearance of complete abstraction, she picked out the dirty clothes from her tin box and began to wash them over the side, pinning each garment out to dry to the awning overhead. And when she had finished the washing, she sat down and did nothing. She did not even look at Allnutt. This was, in fact, the beginning of the great silence. Rose had been able to think of no better way of making Allnutt's life a hell. She did not realize that it was the most effective way possible. During the morning, Allnutt did not take very special notice of his isolation. His wretched mind and body were too much occupied in getting over the effects of drinking a bottle and a half of overproof spirit in a tropical climate. But, as the hours passed, and draught after draught of river water had done much towards restoring their proper rhythm to his physiological processes, he grew restless. He felt that by now he had earned forgiveness for his late carouse, and it irked him unbearably not to be able to talk as much as he was accustomed. He thought Rose was angry at him for his drunkenness. He attached little importance, in his present state, to the matter of his refusal to go on past Shona and down the rapids. "Hot, isn't it?" he said conversationally. Rose remembered a couple of buttons that had to be sewn on. She got out the garment and calmly set about the business. At her first movement, Allnutt had thought some notice of his existence was now about to be taken, and he felt disappointed when the purpose of the movement became apparent. "Putting your things to rights properly, ain't you, miss, eh?" he said. Rose paid no attention. It took only a few minutes for Allnutt to acknowledge the loss of the first round of the contest. "Ain't you going to answer me, miss?" he said. And then, still eliciting no notice, he went on, I'm sorry for what I done last night. I don't mind saying it. What with the gin being there to me hand, like, and the heat and whatnot, I couldn't help having a drop more than I should have had. You've paid me back proper already, pouring all the rest of it away, now haven't you, miss? Fair's fair." Rose made no sign of having heard. Allnutt lost his temper. "Well, you have it your own way, then, you psalm-singing old bitch," he said. And pitching his cigarette end over the side with disgust, he lurched up into the bows. From his earliest days, Allnutt had never been put to the necessity of amusing himself. He had always had companions in his leisure periods. Solitude was as distressing to him as responsibility, and to be cooped up compulsorily in a 30-foot boat was harassing to the nerves, especially nerves as jangled as his. A man of stronger will, or a more intelligent one, might have won the duel with Rose. But Allnutt was far too handicapped. He could not do a chess problem in his head, or devote his thoughts to wondering what was the military situation in Europe, or piece together all the fragments of Shakespeare he could remember. His mind had never been accustomed to doing any continuous thinking, so that in a situation in which there was nothing to do but think, he was helpless. And there was nothing to do at all except listen to the gurgle of the river among the tree roots and endure the attack of insects in the crushing heat. In the end, it even interfered with Allnutt's sleep, which was the surest sign of its effectiveness. Insomnia was quite a new phenomenon to Allnutt, and worried him enormously. Days without exercise for either body or mind, a slightly disordered digestion, and highly irritable nerves combined to deprive him of sleep for one entire night. He shifted and twisted and turned on his uncomfortable bed on the explosives. He sat up and smoked cigarettes. He fidgeted, and he tried again unavailingly. He really thought there was something seriously wrong with him. Then, in the morning, faced with yet another appallingly blank day, he gave in. "Let's hear what you want to do, miss," he said. "Tell us, and we'll do it." "I want to go down the river," said Rose. Once more, appalling visions swept across Allnutt's imagination, of machine guns and rocks and whirlpools, of death by drowning, of capture by the Germans and death in the forest of disease and exhaustion. He was frightened, and yet he felt he could not stay a minute longer in this backwater. He was panicky with the desire to get away, and in his panic he plunged. "All right, miss," he said. "Come on." Some time later, the African Queen steamed out of the backwater into the main river. It was a broad, imposing piece of water here. There was more wind blowing than there had been for some time, and up the length of the river ran long, easy waves 2 feet high, on which the African Queen pitched in realistic fashion, with splashes of spray from the bows, which sizzled occasionally on the boiler. Rose sat at the tiller in a fever of content. The wind and the waves suited her mood. They were on their way to help England once more. The monotony of inaction was at an end. Just before midday, they came in sight of a hill on the right-hand bank, on top of which could be clearly discerned the huts of a mud-walled village. "That's Shona up there on the hill," Allnutt yelled to Rose, gesticulating. He began feverishly to nurse the engines into giving the best possible running. The waist of the launch was heaped with wood, collected that morning. Allnutt crouched behind the pile and hoped he could stop a bullet. He saw that ready to his hand were the chunks of rotten wood which would give an instant blaze and a quick head of extra steam when the moment came. He peered at the gauges. The African Queen came clattering majestically down the river, a feather of smoke from her funnel, spray flying from her bows, a white wake behind her. The Askaris on the hills saw her coming, and ran to fetch the white commandant of the place. He came hurriedly to the mud walls and mounted the parapet, staring at the approaching launch through his field glasses. He took them from his eyes with a grunt of satisfaction. He recognized her as the African Queen, the only launch on the Ulunga, for which he had received special orders from von Hanneken to keep a sharp lookout. She had been lost to sight, skulking in the backwaters, presumably, for some time, and her capture was desirable. Presumably the English missionaries and the mechanic had tired of hiding, or had run short of food and were coming in to surrender. There could be no doubt that this was what they intended, for a mile below Shona, just beyond the next bend, the navigation of the river ceased where it plunged into the gorges. She would be a useful addition to his establishment. He would be able to get about in her far more comfortably than by forest paths. And if ever the English, coming up by the old caravan route, reached the opposite side of the river, the launch would be of great assistance in the defence of the crossing. He was glad she was coming in. The German commandant watched the African Queen, a white speck on the broad river, with some puzzlement. Clearly the people in her did not know where the best landing place was. They were keeping to the outside of the bend in the fast current on the opposite side to the town. They must be intending to come in below the place, where there was a belt of marshy undergrowth. When they came in, he would send a message to them to come back up the river to the canoe landing place, where he could come and inspect them without getting himself filthy and without having to climb the cliff. He walked over to the adjacent face of the town to observe her further progress round the bend. the fools were still keeping to the outside of the bend. He put his hands to his helmet brim, for they were moving now between him and the sun, and the glare was dazzling. They weren't coming in to surrender after all. God knew what they intended, but whatever it was, they must be stopped. He lifted up his voice in a bellow, and his dozen askaris came trotting up, their cartridge belts over their naked chests, their martini rifles in their hands. He gave them their orders, and they grinned happily, for they enjoyed firing off their rifles. They slipped cartridges into the breeches and snapped up the levers. The sergeant chanted the mystic words, which he did not understand, telling them first to aim and then to fire. It was a ragged enough volley when it came. The captain of reserve looked through his glasses. The launch showed no signs of wavering from her course and kept steadily on, although the fools in her must have heard the volley, and some at least of the bullets must have gone somewhere near. "Again," he growled, and a second volley rang out, and still there was no alteration of course on the part of the launch. This was growing serious. They were almost below the town now and approaching the farther bend. He snatched a rifle from one of the askaris, loaded and took aim. They were right in the eye of the sun now, and the glare of the water made the foresight indistinct. It was very easy to lose sight of the white awning of the boat as he aimed. 1,000 meters was a long range for a martini rifle with worn rifling. He fired, reloaded, and fired again. Still the launch kept steadily on. As he pointed the rifle once more at her, something came between him and the launch. It was the trees on the farthest point. They were round the corner. With a curse, he jumped to his feet and ran lumbering along the ramparts with his askaris behind him. Sweating, he galloped down across the village clearing and up the steep path through the forest the other side. Climbing until he thought his heart would burst, he broke through the undergrowth at last at the top of the cliff, where he could look down the last reach of the river before the cataract. The launch had almost reached the farther end. It was just swinging round to take the turn. The captain put his rifle to his shoulder and fired hurriedly twice, although, panting as he was, there was no chance of hitting. Then the launch vanished down the gorge, and there was nothing more he could do. The African Queen was flying along now, for the river was narrowing and its current increasing with every yard. Most of the surface was smooth and sleek, like greased metal, but here and there were ominous furrows and ripples betraying the hidden inequalities of its bed. Rose steered carefully through the smooth water. She found she had to make ample allowance for leeway. So fast was the current that the boat went flying down broadside on towards the obstructions in the course of the turn. There was another bend close ahead, a very sharp one from all appearance. She dragged the tiller across, and the African Queen slithered round the corner, and lurched and rolled and heaved as she encountered the swirls which awaited her there. But the steady thrust of the screw carried her through them. There were rocks in the channel now, with white water boiling around them, and Rose saw them coming up towards her with terrifying rapidity. There was need for instant decision in picking the right course. She pulled the tiller over, and the rocks flashed by. Lower down, the channel was almost obstructed by rocks. She saw a passage wide enough for the boat and swung the bows into it. Stretching down before her, there was a long green slope of racing water, and even as the African Queen heaved up her stern to plunge down it, she saw at the lower end of the fairway a wicked black rock just protruding above the surface. It would rip the whole bottom out of the boat if they touched it. She had to keep the boat steady on her course for a fraction of a second until the channel widened a trifle, and then fling herself on the tiller to swing her over. The boat swayed and rocked, and wriggled like a live thing as she brought the tiller back again to straighten her out. For a dreadful second, it seemed as if the eddy would defeat her efforts. But the engine stuck to its work, and the kick of the propeller forced the boat through the water. They shaved through the gap with inches to spare, and the bows lurched as Rose fought with the tiller, and they swung into the racing eddies at the tail of the rapid. All the air was full of spray, and of the roar of rushing water, whose din was magnified by the cliff close at either side. The sound was terrifying to Allnutt, and so were the lurches and lunges of the boat, but he had no time to look about him. He was far too busy keeping the engine running. He knew even better than did Rose that their lives depended on the propeller giving them steerage way. He had to keep the steam pressure up, and yet well below danger point. He had to work the feed pump. He had to keep the engine lubricated. He knew that they would be lost if he had to stop the engine even for a second. So he bent to his work with panic in his soul, while the boat beneath his feet leaped and bucked and lurched. Out of the tail of his eye he could glimpse rocks flashing past with a speed which told him how great was their own velocity. It was only a few seconds before they reached the next rapid. Like the last, a stretch of ugly rocks and boiling eddies, and green inclined slopes of hurtling water, where the eye had to be quick and the brain quicker still, where the hand had to be steady and strong, and the will resolute. Rose rode the mad whirlwind like a Valkyrie. Her mind was working like a machine with delirious rapidity. She forced the African queen to obey her will and weave a safe course through the clustering dangers. Lower down still, the river tore with incredible speed and without obstruction along a narrow gorge walled in with vertical faces of rock. It was only for a moment that Rose could relax, however, for close ahead the gorge turned a corner so sharply that it looked as if the river plunged into the rock face, and Rose had to make ready for the turn and brace herself to face whatever imminent danger lay beyond out of sight. She kept her eye on the rock at the water's edge on the inside of the bend, and steered to pass it close. The African queen was beginning to turn just before she reached the bend, and the sweep of the current took her over to the opposite bank as if she were no more than a chip of wood, while Rose tugged at the tiller with all her strength. The bows came round, but it looked for a space as if her stern would be flung against the rocks. The propeller battled against the current. The boat just held her own, and then, as they drifted down, the backwash caught her and flung her out again into midstream, so that Rose had to force the tiller across like lightning, and hardly were they straight when she had instantly to pick out a fresh course through the rocks that studded the surface in the flurries of white foam. Towards late afternoon, there was a cessation of cataracts. The river widened a trifle, but the walls of the gorge, although not quite so high, remained nearly vertical still. Between these walls, the river raced with terrific velocity, but without impediment. Rose saw that Allnutt was trying to attract her attention. In the roar of the river he could not make his voice reach her. He stood up, with one anxious eye still on his gauges, and held up a billet of wood, tapped it, and waved his hand at the shore. It was a warning that fuel was running short, and fuel they must have. She nodded, although the next moment she had to look away and peered ahead at the rocks. They shot down a section of the gorge where the half-mile river compressed into 50 yards, and they seemed to be travelling at the speed of a train. The mooring which they desired presented itself very suddenly. A tributary to the Yolanga came in here, not in any conventional way, but by two bold leaps down the precipice to plunge bodily into the water after a 40-foot drop. At this point the river had widened out again, and their speed, although still rapid, was slow enough to give Rose more control over the boat. She just had time to notice the waterfall, to steer clear, and to be drenched by the spray, when she saw that a sudden widening of the channel just below, where the current had eaten away the rocky bank, offered them the assistance of a back eddy in mooring. She called to attract Allnutt's attention, signalled for half speed, and then for reverse. Allnutt's boat hook helped in the manoeuvre, and the African queen came gently to a stop under the steep bank. Allnutt made fast the boat and leaped ashore to look for wood, while Rose looked about her. They had moored in what must have been one of the loveliest corners of Africa. The high banks here were not quite precipices, and there were numerous shelves in the rock, bearing blue and purple flowering plants, which trailed shimmering wreaths down the steep faces. A beam of sunlight reached down over the edge of the gorge and turned its spray into a dancing rainbow. The noise of its fall was not deafening. To ears grown used to the roar of the Yolanga cataracts, it was just a pleasant, musical accompaniment to the joyful singing of the calm, rapid river here. Under the rocky bank it was cool and delicious, with the clear green river coursing alongside. Rose had never before found pleasure in scenery, just as scenery. She stood in the stern and drank in the sweet beauty of it all, smiling at the play of colour in the rainbow at the waterfall. Allnutt came climbing back into the boat from the shore. He was limping a little. "Do you mind having a look at my foot, miss?" he said. "Got a splinter in it up on the bank, and I don't know if it's all out." "Of course," said Rose.
He sat up on the bench in the stern, and Rose, on her knees, slipped the shoe off and took his foot into her hands. She found the place of entry of the splinter and pressed it with her fingertips, while Allnutt twitched with ridiculous ticklishness. She watched the blood come back again. "No, there's nothing there now," she said, and let his foot go. It was the first time she had touched him since they had left the mission. "Thank you, miss," said Allnutt. He lingered on the bench, gazing up at the flowers, while Rose remained on her knees at his feet. "Ain't it pretty?" he said suddenly. There was a little awe in his tone, and his voice was hardly raised loud enough to be heard above the sound of the river. The long hours spent in the echoing turmoil of the cataracts seemed to have muddled their thoughts. Neither of them was thinking clearly. Both of them felt oddly happy and companionable, and yet at the same time they were conscious that something was missing, although they felt it close at hand. Rose watched Allnutt's face as he looked, wondering about him. There was something appealing, almost childlike, about the little man with his dazed smile. She wanted to pet him, and then, noticing this desire in herself, she put it aside as not expressing exactly what it was she wanted, although she could find no better words for it. Both of them were breathing harder than usual, as though undergoing some strain. That waterfall there," said Allnutt hesitatingly. It reminds me—" He never said of what it reminded him. He looked down at Rose beside him. He, too, was glowing with life and inspired by the awesome beauty of the place. He did not know what he was doing when he put out his hand to her throat, sunburned and cool. Rose caught at his hand, to hold it, not to put it away, and he came down to his knees, and their bodies came together. Rose was conscious of kisses, of her racing pulse and her swimming head. She was conscious of hands which pulled at her clothing, and which she could not deny if she would. Probably it had all been inevitable. They had been urged into it by all their circumstances, their solitude, their close proximity, the dangers they had encountered, their healthy life. Even their quarrels had helped. Rose's ingrained prudery had been drastically eradicated during these days of living in close contact with a man, and it was that prudery which had constituted the main barrier between them. There is no room for false modesty or physical shame in a small boat. It was the little gesture of his in coming to her with a splinter in his foot which had broken down the last barrier of her reserve. Rose did not look for perfection in the man she loved. If, as to her certain knowledge he did, Allnutt got drunk, and was not enamoured of the prospect of personal danger, that was only on a par with her father's dyspeptic malignity or Samuel's fits of cold ill temper. These very frailties of his made an insidious appeal to the maternal part of her, and so did his corporal frailty and the hard luck he had always experienced. She yearned for him in a way which differed from and reinforced the clamourings of her emancipated body. As the flame of passion died down in him, and he murmured a few odd, sleepy words to her, she was very happy, and cradled him in her strong arms. Allnutt was very happy too. Whatever he might do in the heat of passion, his need was just as much for a mother as for a mistress. To him there was a comfort in Rose's arms that he had never known before. He felt he could trust her, and depend on her, as he had never trusted nor depended on a woman in his life. All the misery and tension of his life dropped away from him as he pillowed his head on her firm bosom. There was a moment in the early morning light when Rose found herself blushing at the memory of last night's immodesties, and filled with disquiet at the thought of her unmarried condition. But Allnutt's lips were close to hers, and her arms were about his slender body, and memories and disquietude alike vanished as she caught him to her. There was a blushing interval when she had to own that she did not know his name, and when he told her shyly, she savoured the name Charlie over to herself like a schoolgirl, and thought it a very nice name too. When the yearning for the morning cup of tea became quite uncontrollable, it was she who insisted on rising and preparing breakfast.
When breakfast was finished, she took control of the expedition again without a second thought. She took it for granted that they were going on, and that in the end they were going to torpedo the König and Louise. And it did not occur to Allnutt that now that he occupied a privileged position, he might take advantage of it to protest. What with the success they had met with under Rose's command up to now, and with the events of the night, her ascendancy over him was complete. He gathered fuel, and he got up steam with the indifference engendered by routine. Only when they were on the point of departure did either of them waver. Rose found him close beside her, murmuring in a broken voice, "Give us another kiss, old girl." And Rose put her arms around him and kissed him and whispered, "Charlie, dear Charlie." She patted his shoulder, and she looked around at the beauty all about them, and her eyes were wet. Then they cast off, and Allnutt pushed off with the boat hook, and a second later they were in the mad riot of the Yolanga once more, coursing down between the precipices. Somewhere along their route over the next few days, they passed the spot where the Yolanga changes its name and becomes the Bora. Until Spengler had made the descent of the river by canoe, no one had even suspected that the big rapid river which looped its way across the upland plateau and vanished into the gorge at Shona was the same as the stream which appeared in the tangled jungle of the Rift Valley 100 miles from Shona and promptly lost itself again in the vast delta which it had built up for itself on the shore of Lake Wittelsbach. The difference in their names was justified by the difference in their appearance. The speed of the river diminished abruptly, and the character of the banks changed as well. For the Yolanga, travelling at its usual breakneck speed, is charged with all sorts of detritus, and rolls much of its bed with it. No sooner does it reach the flat land than all this matter in suspension is dropped in the form of mud and gravel. Rose and Allnutt quite soon noted indications that the transition was at hand. For some time the current was as fast as ever, and the stream irregular, but the cliffs which walled it in diminished steadily in height and in steepness, until at last they were in no more than a shallow valley, with vast creeper-entangled forest close at hand, and when they emerged from the shade the sun blazed down upon them with a crushing violence they had not known in the sunless gorges of the upper river. The heat was colossal. Despite their motion through the stifling air, they were instantly bathed in sweat. The weather changed with all the suddenness associated with the Rift Valley. Huge black clouds came rushing up the sky, intensifying the dampness of the heat until it could hardly be borne. Directly after came the lightning and the thunder, and the rain came pouring down, blotting out the landscape as effectively as a fog would do. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. The wind died away, and the afternoon sun came out to scorch them, setting the whole surface of the river steaming. With the cessation of the rain came the insects, clouds of them, hungry for blood, filling the air with their whining. Not even Rose and Allnutt's experience of insects on the upper plateau had prepared them for an attack by these insects of the lower valley. They were 10, 20 times as bad. The coming of the evening and the sudden descent of night did nothing towards enfeebling their attacks. It seemed impossible to hope for sleep in that inferno of sticky heat under the constant torture of those winged fiends, but they slept in the end, half-boiled and half-suffocated, and they awoke in the morning with their heads swimming with pain, their joints aching, their throats constricted, so that they could hardly swallow. They had to wallow ashore through stinking mud to find wood, although it seemed agony to move. It took 6 journeys before the African Queen was fully charged with fuel again, sufficient to get them through the day. Already the sun was so hot that the floorboards seemed to burn their feet, and it was only Allnutt's calloused hands which could bear the touch of metalwork. The character of the river and the landscape was changing rapidly. The current was noticeably less, and quite early in the day there ran the last of the rapids of the type they had encountered so frequently before. That indicated the last rocky ledge extending across the bed of the river. They were definitely down the slope and in the bottom of the Rift Valley. There were no snags now. The river was far too deep. With its 1/2 mile of width and 60 feet of depth, the current slackened until it was almost unnoticeable.
On either bank appeared broad fringes of reeds. Beyond them, belts of cane indicated the marshy banks, and beyond the cane could be seen the forest, dark and impenetrable. Out in the centre of the river, the African queen clove her way through the black water under the burning sun. In that vast extent of water, they seemed to be going at a snail's pace. There were loops and bends in the river's course, which they took a full 2 hours to get around. Motiveless bends to all appearance, for there was no alteration in the flat monotony of the banks. For 3 days they headed on down the wide black river. Everything was still. The surface was glassy as they approached it. They went on through the breathless heat, winding eternally round the vast bends of the river. There was just enough mist prevailing to make the distance unreal and indistinct. Rose brought the African queen slowly round one more bend. The mist was thicker here. She could not determine the future course of the river, whether at the bend of this reach it turned to the left or to the right. They were nearing the dark green of the forest and the brighter green strip of the reeds now. Rose could see a vast length of it, with some precision, but there was no break. She came to the conclusion that the river must have doubled nearly back upon itself. She put the tiller over to starboard to approach the left-hand bank, and there was no satisfaction to be found there. There was only the unbroken bank of reeds and the eternal forest, and moreover, something in the contour of that skyline seemed to tell her that it was not in that direction that the river found an exit. For a moment, she dallied with the idea that perhaps the river ended altogether somewhere in this neighbourhood, but she immediately put that notion aside as ridiculous. Rivers only end thus abruptly in deserts, not in rain-beaten forests of this sort. She put the tiller over again, and began to steer the African queen steadily along the edge of the fringe of reeds. Whatever happened to the river, she was bound to find out if she kept along its bank for long enough. Nervously, Allnutt closed the throttle until the propeller was hardly revolving, and the African queen glided among the reeds at a snail's pace. Rose nodded approval, for they did not want to run any risks with the propeller. Slowly they glided on. At each side the growth of reeds became denser and denser. The delta of the Bora is a mangrove swamp, a region in which the water puts up a good fight against the land, which is slowly invading it. The mud in which the trees grew was half water, as black and nearly as liquid. The next few days were a nightmare time of filth and sludge and stench. The all-pervading mud spread by degrees over everything in and upon the boat, and with it came its sickening stench. It was a place of twilight, where everything had to be looked at twice to make sure what it was. So, as every step might disturb a snake whose bite would be death, their flounderings in the mud were of necessity cautious. Worse than anything else, it was a place of malaria. Every morning they were prostrated by it, almost simultaneously. Their heads ached. They felt a dull coldness creeping over them. Their teeth began to chatter until they were helpless in the paroxysm, their faces drawn and lined, their fingernails blue with cold. They lay side by side in the bottom of the boat, with the silent mangrove forest around them, clutching their filthy rags despite the sweltering steamy heat which they could not feel. Then at last the cold would pass, and the fever would take its place, a nightmare fever of delirium and thirst and racking pain, until, when it seemed they could bear it no more, the blessed sweat would appear and the fever die away, and they slept for an hour or two. They never saw the sun while they were in that twilight nightmare land, and the channel twisted and turned so that they lost all sense of direction and had no idea at all to which point of the compass they were heading. When the channel they were following joined another one, they had to look to see which way the water was flowing to decide in which direction to turn. And where it was so dark that even the water grass could not grow, they had to note the direction of drift of bits of wood placed on the surface,
an almost imperceptible drift, not more than a few yards an hour. They lost all count of time. Days came and went, each with its bout of chill and fever. It was day when there was light enough to see, and night when the twilight had encroached so much that they could do no more, and how many days they passed thus, they never knew. They did not notice the first hopeful signs of their progress. The channel they were in was like any other channel, and when it joined another channel, it was only what had happened 100 times before. But when yet another large channel came in, they began to fill with hope. The bows were thinning overhead so that it grew steadily lighter. The channel was deep and wide, and although it was choked with water-grass, that was only a mere trifle to them now after some of the obstacles they had been through. And then the channel broadened so that real sunlight reached them, and Allnutt could wait no longer before speaking about it, even if it should be unlucky. "You think we got through it, Rosie?" he said. Rose hesitated before she spoke. It seemed far too good to be true. "Yes," she said at length. "I think we have." It was a very definite mouth of the borer by which they had emerged. There was a fairly wide channel through the reeds, and they had no sooner entered it and turned one single corner than the limitless prospect of the lake opened before them. Golden water as far as the eye could see ahead, broken only by 1 or 2 islands. There was clear water 40 miles broad and 80 long in front of them, and not a rock, nor a shoal, nor a reed, nor a mangrove to impede them. The sensation of freedom and relief was absolutely delicious. Moored among the reeds with the African Queen actually rocking a little to a minute swell coming in from the lake, they slept more peacefully than they had done for days. In the morning they washed the whole boat, and they got themselves clean too for the first time since their entry into the mangroves. It was early evening when they noticed something out on the lake, something besides water and reeds and sky and islands. It was not a cloud, it was a smudge of black smoke, and beneath it a white dot. Rose's heart leaped violently in her breast, but she forced composure on herself. "Charlie," she said, "what's that?" One glance was sufficient for Allnutt, as it had been for Rose. "That's the Louisa," he said quietly. "Coming this way," she said. And then she forced herself again to stay calm. She had the sense and presence of mind to realize that if a ship the size of the Carnegie Louise was only a dot to them, they must be less than a dot to it. With the top hamper stowed away, the African Queen had a freeboard of hardly 3 feet. They would be quite safe among the reeds, unless they were looked for specially. And Rose knew that the Germans would have no idea that the African Queen was on the lake. The Carnegie Louise had altered course a trifle, and was standing out from the shore. They watched her as she steamed across the lake, keeping just above their horizon, heading for the islands which they could see straight opposite them. "She's anchoring there for the night," said Allnutt. "Look." As the Carnegie Louise came to a stop, the flag at her stern disappeared, as is laid down as a rule to be followed at sunset in the imperial instructions for captains of ships of the Imperial German Marine. "Well, there they are," said Allnutt, "and there they'll stay. That's a good anchorage out there among the islands." "We ought to have been ready for them," said Rose. Allnutt puffed thoughtfully at his cigarette. "Don't you worry," he said. "I've been thinking. You know what these Germans are? They lay down systems, and they sticks to 'em. Yet Mondays they're at one place, Tuesdays they're somewhere else, Wednesdays, well, perhaps they're here. I don't know what day it is today. It's Saturday night, so I expect they'll go to Port Livingston and lay up over Sunday. Then he starts again on Monday, the same old round. They'll come here again. You just see if they don't." "Yes," said Rose. There could be little doubt that if the Carnegie Louise had once moored among those islands, she would do so again. "Charlie," she said, and her voice was gentle. "Yes, old girl?" "You must start getting those torpedoes ready tomorrow morning, as soon as it's light." "How long will it take?" "Oh, might have it done in a couple of days," said Allnutt, "if we don't have malaria too bad." He was silent for a moment or two, and then he spoke again. You needn't come, old girl. I can manage it myself easy." "But that wouldn't be fair," said Rose. "It's you who ought to stay behind. I can manage the launch on my own, as far as those islands." It was an odd argument that developed. Allnutt was perfectly prepared by now to throw away the life that had seemed so precious to him. This plan of Rose's, which had already materialized so far, and so surprisingly had become like a living thing to him, there would be something wrong about leaving it incomplete, and somehow the sight of the König and Louise cruising round the lake as bold as brass had irritated him. He was aflame with partisanship. He was ready for any mad sacrifice. Allnutt tried to argue that for him there would be no serious risk. He could dive off the stern of the boat a second before the crash, as soon as he was sure she would attain the target. It all ended, as was inevitable, in their agreeing that they would both go. And there was no denying that their best chance of success lay in having one person to steer and one to tend the engine. It was further agreed between them that when they were 50 yards from the König and Louise, one of them would jump overboard with the lifebuoy. But Allnutt thought that it was settled, that Rose should do the jumping, and Rose thought it would be Allnutt. In the morning, they saw the König and Louise get under way and steam off to the northward again on her interminable patrolling of the lake. With Rose's help, Allnutt extricated the 2 heavy gas cylinders from the bottom of the boat. He turned on the taps, and the air was filled with an explosive hissing as the gas poured out and the pressure gauge needles moved slowly back to 0. When the hissing had subsided, Allnutt got to work with his tools and extracted the whole nose fitting from each cylinder. There was left a round blank hole in each, opening into the empty dark within. Very carefully they prized open the boxes of explosive. They were packed with what looked like fat candles of pale yellow wax, each wrapped in oiled paper. Allnutt methodically and cautiously packed them into the cylinders. When he had finished, he opened his locker and brought out his revolver, broke it open, and took out the cartridges. Then, very laboriously, he shaped with his knife 2 round discs of hard wood, which would screw tightly into the noses of the cylinders. In each disc, he pierced 3 holes of such a size that he could just force the cartridge into them. When the disc was in place in the cylinder nose, and the cylinder was pointing out beyond the bows of the African Queen, the boat herself would be a locomotive torpedo. When she was driven at full speed against the side of a ship, the cartridges would explode into the high explosive packed in the cylinders. There were 3 cartridges to each cylinder. At least one ought to explode. There were 2 cylinders, each containing nearly 100 weight of explosive. 1 cylinder, let alone 2, ought to settle a little ship like the König and Louise. The next job was to cut 2 holes, 1 each side of the stem, in the African Queen's bows, just above the waterline. When they were finished, Rose and Allnutt dragged and pushed the cylinders forward until their noses were well out through the holes, a good foot in front of any part of the boat. Allnutt stuffed the ragged edges with chips of wood and rags. He nailed them solidly into position with battens split from the cases of provisions. When he was finished, he sat down with a sigh. The whole operation had taken 3 days. "Well, old girl," he said, "we've done it all now. Everything. We're all ready." Allnutt had been right in his guess about the methodical habits of the Germans. In their careful patrolling of the lake, they never omitted a periodical cruise into this, the most desolate corner of the Wittelsbach Nyanza, just to see that all was well. One morning they looked out over the reeds and saw her, just as before, a smudge of smoke and a white dot coming down from the north. Just as before, she steamed steadily to the south. As the day was waning, she came to a stop at the point where she had anchored before. It was almost dark by now. The young moon was low in the sky. Soon there would be only the stars to give them light. They had all night before them. They knew that as it was a question of surprise, the best time they could reach the König and Louise would be in the early hours of the morning.
Allnutt quietly took the detonators from the locker and went into the water over the bows. He was a long time there while he screwed the detonators home into the noses of the cylinders. In the almost pitch dark, Rose saw him back away from the torpedoes and come round at a safe distance to the side of the boat. His hands reached up, and he swung himself on board, dripping. "Done it," he whispered. There was a wind blowing now, and the African Queen was very definitely pitching to the motion of the water. Allnutt unfastened the side painter and took the boat hook. A good thrust against a clump of reeds sent the boat out into the fairway. He laid the boat hook down and felt for the throttle valve and opened it. The propeller began its beat, and the engine its muffled clanking. Rose stood at the tiller and steered out down the dark river mouth. The African Queen issued forth upon the lake. If it had been daylight, they would have marked the banking up of the clouds overhead, the tense stickiness of the electricity-charged atmosphere. If they had been experienced in lake conditions, they would have known what that ominous wind foretold. They had no knowledge of the incredible speed with which the wind whipping down from the mountains of the north roused the shallow waters of the lake to maniacal fury. Rose had had her training in rivers. It did not occur to her to look for danger where there were no rocks, nor reeds, nor rapids. When in the darkness the African Queen began to pitch and wallow in rough water, she cared nothing for it. She felt no appreciation of the fact that the shallow draught launch was not constructed to encounter rough water, and that she was out of reach of land now in a boat whose wall sides and flat bottom made her the least seaworthy vessel it is possible to imagine. She found it difficult to keep her feet as the African Queen swayed and staggered about in haphazard fashion. Waves were crashing against the flat sides. The top of them were coming in over the edge. But that sort of thing was in Rose's mind only to be expected in open water. She had no fear at all. Then suddenly the darkness was torn away for a second by a dazzling flash of lightning, which revealed the wild water around them, and the thunder followed with a single loud bang like 1,000 cannons fired at once. Then came the rain, pouring down through the blackness in solid rivers, numbing and stupefying, and with the rain came the wind again, suddenly from a fresh quarter, laying its grip on the torn surface of the lake and heaving it up into mountains. With the shift of the wind, the African Queen began to pound, lifting her bows out of the water and bringing them down again with a shattering crash. Suddenly, Allnutt was at Rose's side. He was putting her arm through the huge lumbering lifebuoy which had always seemed to bulk so unnecessarily large in the boat's equipment. Then, as they tottered and swayed in the drenching dark, he was taken from her. She tried to call to him unavailingly. She felt a surge of solid water round her waist. A wave smacked her in the face. She was strangling with the water in her nostrils. The African Queen had sunk, and with her ended the gallant attempt to torpedo the Königin Louise, and as though the storm had been raised just for Germany's benefit, it suddenly died away, and the wayward water fell smooth again. The captain of the Königin Louise, acting as president of the court, looked with curiosity at the prisoner. The prisoner was a sick man. That was obvious, additionally to his weary and disheartened manner, and his feebleness was due to illness as well as to fatigue. The captain told himself that if ever he had seen the characteristic features of malaria, he saw them now in the prisoner. The prosecuting officer stated the case against the prisoner. There must be due regard to formalities, even though it involved telling the court facts which were perfectly well known to it. The prisoner had been seen on the island of Prince Eitel at dawn, and having been promptly hunted down and arrested, could give no account of himself. The prosecuting officer pointed out that on the island were kept reserve stores of fuel for the Königin Louise, which an evilly disposed person might easily destroy. Additionally, the island offered unrivalled opportunities for spying on the movements of the Königin Louise. The president leaned forward and tapped the table sharply with his pencil. "What is your nationality?" he asked in German. Allnutt looked at him stupidly. "Belgian?" asked the president. "English?" At the word English, Allnutt nodded. "English," he said. "British." "Your name?" asked the president in German, and then, doing his best to remember his English, he repeated the question.
Charles Allnutt, what were you doing on the island?
Nothing, said Allnutt sullenly. He thought it wiser not to own up to the affair of the African Queen. The President sighed. He would have to pass sentence of death, he could see. At that moment there was a bustle outside the tiny, crowded cabin. The door opened and a petty officer came in, bringing with him a fresh prisoner. At the sight of her, the President rose to his feet, stooping under the low deck, for the prisoner was a woman, and obviously a white woman, despite her deep tan. The petty officer explained that they had found the woman on another island, and, with her, something else. He swung into view a lifebuoy, and on it they could see the name African Queen. African Queen, said the President to himself, raking back in his memory for something half forgotten. He opened the drawer in his table and searched through a mass of papers until he found what he sought. It was a duplicate of the notice sent by von Hanneken, the captain of reserve at Schona. Until that moment the news of a missing steam launch on the Upper Ulanga had had no interest at all for the captain of the König and Louise, and now it was different. Already he had guessed much. These two people must be the mechanic and the missionary's sister. Presumably they had abandoned their launch, come down in a canoe, and been wrecked in last night's storm when trying to cross the lake to the Belgian Congo. He began to question Rose. It was an enormous relief to find that she actually knew a little German. It was far more of a surprise when it came out that Allnutt and Rose had brought the African Queen down the rapids of the Ulanga and through the Bora Delta. There could be no doubting her statement, and the captain looked at Rose and marvelled. He had heard from Spengler's own lips an account of the rapids. He had also heard about the stoicism and ability of English women, and here was clear proof. Anyway, there could be no question now of espionage and the death penalty. He could not hang one person without the other, and he never thought for a moment of hanging Rose. She had brought a steam launch from the Upper Ulanga to the lake, and that was a feat for which he could feel a professional admiration. He looked round the cabin. "The court is dismissed," he snapped. The prosecuting officer and the rest of the court saluted and filed out of the cabin, while the captain tapped on the table meditatively with his pencil and decided on his future action. These two ought, of course, to be interned. That was what von Hanneken would do if he took them to the mainland. But they were ill, and they might die in imprisonment. It was not right that two people who had achieved so much should die in an enemy's hands. All the laws of chivalry dictated that he should do more than that for them. The post of senior naval officer, Port Albert, Belgian Congo, was of very new creation. It was only the night before that it had come into being. It was a chance of war that the senior naval officer in a Belgian port should be an English lieutenant commander. This morning he was pacing along the jetty, inspecting the preparation for sea of the squadron under his command. Seeing that it comprised only 2 small motorboats, it seemed a dignified name for it. But those motorboats had cost in blood and sweat and treasure more than destroyers might have done. For they had been sent out from England and had been brought with incredible effort overland through the jungle by rail and by river to the harbour in which they lay. They were 30-knot boats, and in their bows each had an automatic 3-pounder gun. 30 knots, and those guns would make short work of the König and Louise. The lieutenant commander paced the jetty impatiently. He was anxious to get to work now that the weary task of transport was completed. The sooner they came out on the hunt for the König and Louise, the better. He gazed out over the lake and stopped suddenly. There was smoke on the horizon, and below it a white dot. As he looked, a lieutenant came running along the jetty to him. He had binoculars in his hand. "That's the König and Louise in sight, sir," he said breathlessly, and offered the glasses. The lieutenant commander stared through them at the approaching vessel. "Half a minute," said the lieutenant commander. "That's not a German ensign on the foremast. It's a white flag." He had hardly finished speaking before the König and Louise rounded to, broadside onto the shore, far out of range of her 6-pounder. They saw a puff of white smoke from her bow, and the report of a gun came slowly over to them. They saw the white flag at the foremast come down halfway, and then mount again to the masthead. "That means they want to parley," said the lieutenant commander. "All right, I'll go myself. You stay here. You're in command while I'm out there." If you see any need to fire, fire like the blazes. Don't mind me. Understand?" The lieutenant nodded. 5 minutes later, he watched through his glasses as the lieutenant commander's launch headed out from the shore. He saw it reach the gunboat and vanish round the far side. There was an anxious delay, and then at last the launch reappeared. She was coming back. There came another puff of smoke as the König and Louise fired a parting salute, and then she turned away and headed back towards the invisible German shore. The launch ran briskly in, and the lieutenant saw the lieutenant commander in the stern sheets. Lying in the bottom of the boat were 2 new passengers, at whom the lieutenant stared in surprise. One of them was a woman. The next day, the König and Louise, as she steamed in solemn dignity over the lake she had ruled so long, saw 2 long grey shapes come hurtling over the water towards her, half screened in a smother of spray. The commander, who had been president of the court-martial 2 days before, looked at them through his glasses as they tore straight along towards them. "Action stations," he snapped. "Get that gun firing." The prosecuting officer ran madly to the gun. The defending officer sprang to the wheel to oversee the coloured quartermaster and to make sure the commander's orders were promptly obeyed. Round came the König and Louise to face her enemies. Her feeble gun spoke once, twice, with pitiful slowness. HMS Matilda and HMS Amelia swerved to one side. At 30 knots they came tearing round in a wide sweep, just outside the longest range of that old 6-pounder. The König and Louise was slow on her helm, and with a vast turning circle, she could not wheel quick enough to keep her bows towards those flying grey shapes, which swept round her in a decreasing spiral. The lieutenant commander stood amidships in the Matilda. The engine bellowed fit to deafen him, but he eyed coolly the curving course which was bringing his ship fast towards the enemy's stern, where there was no gun to bear. It was his duty not merely to win the easy victory, but to see that victory was won at the smallest cost. He looked back to see that the Amelia was in her proper station, looked at the range again, and then waved his hand to the sub-lieutenant in the bows by the gun. The 3-pounder shells began to burst about the König and Louise's stern. At first they merely blew holes in the thin plating, and then soon there was no plating left to explode them. They flew on into the bowels of the ship, spreading destruction and fire everywhere, each of them 2 pounds of flying metal and a pound of high explosive. The lieutenant commander kept his boats dead astern, and from that safe position sent the deadly little shells raking through and through the ship from stern to bow. The König and Louise had not really been designed as a fighting ship. Her engines and boilers were above the waterline instead of being far below under a protective deck. Soon one of those little shells came flying through the bulkhead, followed by another and another. There was a deep, sullen roar as the boiler was hit, and the König and Louise was wreathed in a cloud of steam. The engine-room staff were boiled alive in that moment. The lieutenant commander of the Matilda saw the steam gush out, and he gave a quick order. The roar of the Matilda's engine was stilled as the engine was put out of gear. When the steam cleared away, the König and Louise was lying a helpless hulk in the water, drifting very slowly, and the motorboats were lying silent, still safely astern. He looked for a sign of surrender, but he could see none. The Black Cross was still flying, challenging the red. Something hit the water beside the Matilda, with a plop and a jet of water. Some heroic souls on the König and Louise were firing at them with rifles, and even at 1.5 miles, a Mauser bullet can kill. "Hell," said the lieutenant commander. He did not want to kill the wretched Germans who were achieving nothing in prolonging their defence. God damn it. All right, then. He shouted an order to the gun's crew in the bows, and the fire recommenced. "Perhaps that'll settle them," he said after several minutes, and he signalled for fire to cease. He looked at the König and Louise again. She lay motionless, hazed with smoke and steam, but the black flag was still flying. Then the lieutenant commander saw that she was lower in the water, and as he noticed it, the König and Louise very suddenly fell over to one side. The commander had done his duty. He had groped his way through the wrecked engines to the seacocks, and had opened them. "Hope we can save the poor beggars," said the lieutenant commander, calling for full speed. The Matilda and the Amelia came rushing up just as the German ensign, the last thing to disappear, dipped below the surface. They were in time to save all the living except the hopelessly wounded. The next day, Rose and Allnutt sat silently together in the lieutenant commander's stifling office. He inquired briefly about their health, and then said awkwardly, "There's a Belgian escort going down to the coast with prisoners. I'm going to send you with them." He looked at Allnutt. "You'll be going to join up, I suppose," he said. "I can't enlist you here, of course, but down on the coast you'll find a British consul at Matadi, I think, or somewhere there. The Belgians will put you on the right track anyway. Any British consul will do your business for you, as soon as you're over your malaria, of course. And they'll send you round to join one of the South African units, I expect, so you'll be all right." "Yes, sir," said Allnutt. "And you, Miss Sayer, isn't it?" went on the lieutenant commander. "I think the West Coast's the best solution of the problem for you, too, don't you? You can get back to England from there." "Yes," said Rose. "Oh, that's all right, then," said the lieutenant commander with relief. "You'll be starting in 2 or 3 hours." It was hard to expect a young officer planning the conquest of a country half the size of Europe to devote more attention to 2 civilian castaways. It was that miss of the lieutenant commander's which really settled Rose's future. When they came out of the lieutenant commander's presence, Rose was seething with shame. Until then she had been a woman without a future, and in consequence without any real care. It was different now. The lieutenant commander had mentioned the possibility of a return to England. To Rose that meant a picture of poor streets and censorious people and prying aunts, and it was terribly painful to contemplate a separation from Allnutt. He had been so much to her. She had hardly been out of his sight for weeks now, and to lose him would be like losing a limb. She could not contemplate this unforeseen future of hers without Allnutt. "Charlie," she said urgently, "we've got to get married." "Cool," said Allnutt. This was an aspect of the situation he actually had not thought of. "We must do it as quickly as we can," said Rose. "A consul can marry people. That officer in there spoke about a consul. As soon as we get to the coast—" Allnutt was a little dazed and stupid. This unlooked-for transfer to the west coast of Africa, this taken-for-granted enlistment in the South African forces, and now this new proposal, left him with hardly a word to say. He thought of Rose's moderate superiority in social status. He thought about money. Presumably he would receive pay in the South African army. He thought about the girl he had married 12 years ago when he was 18. She had probably been through 6 men's hands by now, but there had never been a divorce, and presumably he was still married to her. Oh, well. South Africa and England were a long way apart, and she couldn't trouble him much. "Right-o, Rosie," he said. "Let's." So they left the lake and began the long journey to Matadi and marriage. As to whether or not they lived happily ever after is not easily decided.